For 900 years, they have called themselves conquerors. But the DNA doesn't lie, and it just told 85 million people who they actually are. In 1071, a Turkic army from the steppes of Central Asia rode onto the plain of Manzikert and shattered the Byzantine Empire forever. That single afternoon is taught in Turkey as the birth of a nation. Turkish identity, the language, the flag, the name itself traces back to that moment, to those horsemen from the east. So scientists asked a simple question. If modern Turkish people are the descendants of those Central Asian conquerors, their DNA should prove it. They sequenced the genomes of thousands of Anatolians and lined them up against every empire that ever ruled this land. The Hittites, the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Seljuk Turks who gave the country its name. Only one population matched. And when the results came back, it wasn't the empire anyone expected, and it rewrote what being Turkish actually means. Every nation needs an origin story. For modern Turkey, that story begins on horseback. Somewhere on the vast grasslands east of the Caspian Sea, a Turkic people called the Oghuz began moving west, pressured by rival clans, pulled by opportunity, pushed by the endless restlessness of steppe life. By the 11th century, under a dynasty called the Seljuks, they had swept through Persia, taken Baghdad, and stood at the edge of a Byzantine world that had ruled Anatolia for 1,000 years. At Manzikert, the Seljuks didn't just win a battle, they captured the Byzantine emperor himself. Within a generation, Turkic-speaking dynasties controlled most of Anatolia. Within 4 centuries, their descendants, the Ottomans, commanded an empire spanning 3 continents. The name Turkey is not a geographic accident. It is a genealogical claim. It says, this land belongs to the people who arrived on horseback from Central Asia. That claim has shaped everything school textbooks, national holidays, the mythology stitched into flags and anthems. But genes don't read textbooks. And when researchers finally asked what the DNA actually said, the answer arrived like a quiet earthquake. Here is what the Manzikert story leaves out. Anatolia was never empty land waiting for a conqueror. By the time the Seljuks arrived, this peninsula had already absorbed 9,000 years of continuous human settlement. The Hittites built an empire here that rivaled Egypt. Greek city-states colonized its coastlines 1,000 years before Christ. Persian satraps governed it. Alexander marched through it. Rome ruled it for 6 centuries, and after Rome split, the Byzantines ruled it for 1,000 more. Every one of those civilizations didn't just pass through, they stayed, farmed, intermarried, and raised children on this soil for dozens of generations. Genetically speaking, Anatolia by the 11th century wasn't a blank page. It was one of the densest, most continuously inhabited gene pools on Earth. So when a new conquering population arrives, even one that changes the language, the religion, and the ruling class entirely, the question a geneticist asks is brutally simple. How much of the biological population actually changed? Was Anatolia repopulated by newcomers? Or did the newcomers become a thin ruling layer over millions of people who were already there? To answer that question, population geneticists didn't just look at living Turkish citizens in isolation, they built a comparative map. On one side, ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains. Hittite-era burials, Greek colonial cemeteries, Roman period graves, Byzantine tombs scattered across Anatolia. On the other side, genetic samples representing the historical Turkic populations of Central Asia, the Oghuz-related steppe groups most closely tied to the Seljuk and Ottoman ruling dynasties. Then they sequenced the genomes of thousands of modern Turkish citizens across dozens of provinces, and ran the comparison against every one of those ancient reference populations, measuring shared genetic markers, haplogroups, and admixture proportions with the same statistical tools used to trace ancestry in Iceland, Ireland, and Italy. This wasn't a fringe study. It built on more than a decade of published population genetics research into Anatolian ancestry, the kind of data that shows up in journals, not just headlines. And the pattern that emerged was almost too consistent to be a coincidence. here is the finding. Across nearly every study conducted on modern Turkish genetic ancestry, the dominant genetic signature in the population is not Central Asian, it is Anatolian. Overwhelmingly so. Depending on the region and the study, the Central Asian Turkic genetic contribution to the modern population sits somewhere in the range of 10 to 20%. The remaining bulk, the majority of the genome, traces directly back to the populations who were already living in Anatolia before the Seljuks ever crossed the Euphrates. Descendants of the Hittites, the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, and above all, the Byzantines. In other words, the empire that matched modern Turkish DNA most closely wasn't the one that gave the country its name and its language. It was the empire the Seljuks and Ottomans are remembered for defeating. Genetically, the closest ancestors of most Turkish citizens today are the Byzantines, and the older Anatolian populations underneath them. Not the horsemen of the steppe. The conquerors changed the language. They changed the religion. They changed the ruling class, the architecture, the calendar, the alphabet eventually. What they did not change in any complete sense was the underlying population. Turkish-speaking Muslim Anatolia is biologically still substantially Byzantine Anatolia. This is not actually as strange as it first sounds, and geneticists are careful to say so. Conquest rarely means replacement. Throughout history, small warrior elites have repeatedly taken over much larger settled populations. Norman knights ruling Anglo-Saxon England, Manchu rulers governing Han China, Arab dynasties administering Persian and Coptic populations. In almost every case, the language and elite culture of the conquerors spread far wider than their actual genetic footprint, because language, religion, and identity are transmitted socially through marriage, conversion, and generations of daily life, not purely through bloodline. Anatolia followed the same pattern, just especially thoroughly. Turkic dynasties provided the ruling class, the Turkish language, and eventually Ottoman Islam. But the millions of farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople who adopted that language and that faith over centuries were, in overwhelming genetic terms, still the descendants of the people who had always lived there. So the DNA isn't contradicting Turkish identity. It's revealing what identity actually is, a story a population tells about itself, layered on top of a much older, much messier biological reality. So what does it mean to be Turkish? If the DNA doesn't point back to the Turks, it means the same thing it means to be Italian without being Roman, or English without being Anglo-Saxon, or Egyptian without being a pharaoh's direct descendant. Nations are not bloodlines. They are inherited languages, inherited stories, inherited land carried forward by whoever happens to be born into them, regardless of where their great-great-grandparents' ancestors actually came from. But there is something genuinely unsettling about discovering that the empire your national identity was built on defeating is, biologically, closer to you than the empire your identity is named after. It forces an uncomfortable question that goes far beyond Turkey. How much of any national identity is ancestry, and how much of it is simply the last story that won? Modern Turkish citizens are not less Turkish for carrying Byzantine, Greek, and ancient Anatolian ancestry. If anything, they are the living proof that Anatolia's identity was never singular. It was always a palimpsest, one civilization written over another, never fully erasing what came before. Every empire that ever marched across Anatolia believed it was writing the final chapter. The Hittites believed it. The Greeks believed it. Rome believed it. The Byzantines believed it. And the Seljuks and Ottomans believed it too. But the DNA in the blood of 85 million people today tells a quieter, older story than any of them, one that was never conquered, only renamed. So the next time someone tells you their nation's story began with a single battle, a single dynasty, a single bloodline, ask what the DNA would say if anyone actually tested it. Because in Anatolia, the answer wasn't the empire everyone was taught to remember. It was the one everyone was taught to forget. If this changed how you think about identity, history, or the story your own nation tells about itself, subscribe. Because next week, we're testing another empire's DNA against the people who claim its legacy, and the results are even harder to believe.